So I'll pass over to Tommy Martinez to say a few words about Pioneer Works.
Yes, thank you, Kelsa. Can you hear me? Good. Kelsa, Maddie, and the rest of the New Ink team for hosting us today. Um, as you mentioned, it's always wonderful to bring the cohorts together for a conversation. There's so many overlapping areas of support and work that we do, and it's clear that our interests are very much aligned from these kinds of conversations. In addition to that, we've worked with so many of the same amazing practitioners. It's always cool to see someone from here um, go to your residency and similarly hear that one of our residents in this space at the moment had recently gone through your space as well. There's a lot of um, synergy there. Um, the last time we brought everybody together was just the beginning of the pandemic. I think that maybe we had planned on a physical gathering, which had to quickly become a virtual one, and we were still fairly optimistic about that kind of gathering and excited by it, and it was fun. Um, but since then, I think due to the nature of how our lives would look over the year, we've begun to grow a little tired of this kind of Zoom style meeting. However, I think it has opened up so many opportunities for coming together, and I think has really helped us consider much more how we fight for justice and equity in digital spaces and how that's a conversation that needs to happen. Um, and has also helped us think about how we fight in the real world using tools of digital spaces and technology. So the gathering tonight is held for us to consider the ways that we can reclaim dwelling spaces and rethink public spaces with emerging practices. So as a technologist, I'm really interested to hear not just about how this idea of spatial justice relates to the physical world, but also how we think of space in a digital one. So that's something that I'd like to kind of pin at the beginning as something that I'm interested in hearing a little bit about. So I am Tommy Martinez. I work at Pioneer Works as the Director of Technology, and I lead a residency program that, among other areas of work, supports individuals proposing solutions to social issues using new technology, or examining how technology plays a role and the tech industry plays a role in amplifying these issues to begin with. This is purposely left a little open-ended to allow people in our space to work from a number of different approaches, which they do. So with that, I want to introduce Ariana Faye Allensworth, who is speaking tonight and was recently a resident at Pioneer Works, a tech resident. Ariana Faye Allensworth is a visual artist and researcher based in Brooklyn, New York. Her work builds upon interests in photography, spatial justice, and the politics of the archive. She has over 10 years of experience as a cultural producer and arts administrator, specializing in arts education and social impact strategy. She currently works as a senior design lead at IDEO and has previously held positions at the International Center of Photography, the Center for Cultural Power, Youth Speaks, and Cultural Engagement Lab. Ariana is also a founding member of the New York City chapter of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and a Winter 2021 technology resident. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ariana to speak and present a little bit about her work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tommy. It's really great to be here today. I'm gonna quickly share my screen. I have a few slides to introduce myself with. Can y'all see my screen? Cool. Cool. So again, my name's Ariana. It's really wonderful to be in conversation with y'all today. I thought I could start by sharing a little bit about some of the things that inform my work, which, as Tommy mentioned in my bio, really builds upon interest in photography, spatial and housing justice, and the politics of the archive. And one of the reasons that I really love photography is because of its relationship to time and its ability to function as a portal to past and future memory. And my fascination with the medium really began with photographing ephemera from my own family archive, and photographs like this one that you can see here of my dad and his siblings in the San Francisco's Fillmore district in the 1970s have been a huge impetus for my commitment to making and thinking about pictures and the multitude of ways that places can be remembered. Not only was this photograph a way of locating my family in the topography of the Bay Area during a time when the city's Black population was nearly 5 times larger than the San Francisco that I grew up in, but it was also around this time that my dad learned about the town of Allensworth by one of his advisors at the City College of San Francisco. And Allensworth is a town located in Southern California that was founded by, in 1908 by a formerly enslaved man named Allen Allensworth, and is the only town in California to be fully ever financed, governed, and inhabited by Black people. And so upon learning of this history, my dad did some research and learned that Allen was his great-great-uncle. And up until that moment, my dad nor any of our extended family had any knowledge of this history. And so reclaiming this rupture in our own family's memory was really core to my upbringing. And I like to think that a similar politics of reclamation is really expressed in the work that I do today. I thought I could share just highlights from 2 projects that kind of relate to some of the themes of today. And then I'll pass it back to Kelsey and Tommy to share a little, introduce our other speakers. So the first project I wanted to quickly highlight is a project called Staying Power, which is a collaborative art and research project that celebrates the people's history of New York City public housing. And I've been working on for the past couple of years through the support of Pioneer Works residency, as well as the Laundromat Project's Create Change Artists in Residence program. And the project overall kind of presents maps and stories and images of the memories and experiences of folks raised and living in NYCHA, which is, for those not in New York, New York's public housing system. And the project website, which you can see a glimpse of here, really functions as a platform for publishing, discussion, and visual representation about community histories of NYCHA. And the work really aims to respond to representational gaps in the current narrative about public housing, really by positioning residents as experts, archivists, and storytellers. And the project really seeks to push up against the dominant narrative about the failure of public housing and use artistic devices and storytelling devices like photography and oral history and community-based mapping to allow new narratives to emerge. And then the second project I'll highlight is the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is a volunteer-run collective I've been a part of for the past many years. Our project really seeks to create a counter-narrative around gentrification and displacement and tenants' rights issues, all in service of really emboldening housing justice movements. And we employ a variety of modalities to advance those goals, including bringing visibility to landscapes of injustice through the mapping of open data about evictions and displacement, and also researching and making information available about folks that are fueling gentrification through real estate speculation and corporate landlordism, and also collecting oral histories and producing storytelling projects with tenants. The project was founded in the San Francisco Bay Area in 2013 and really in response to heightened evictions in the face of the tech boom 2.0 in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we now have chapters in New York City, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area. So I'll pause there and pass the floor back to Kelsey and Tommy, but that's a little bit about me and my work, and I look forward to being in conversation in a few. Thanks.
Thank you, Ariana, and thank you for sending us down this path of situating the work that we do in history and in place. Really, really important. And yeah, just so excited to dig in. And before we do, we have 2 incredible additional speakers to hear from, Ashley, Jane Lewis, and Eric Moed. Ashley first, I'll just give a quick introduction to her work at New Ink with us this year. Ashley Jane Lewis is a creative technologist, educator, and new media artist with a focus on Afrofuturism, bioart, social justice, and speculative design. Her artistic practice explores Black cultures of the past, present, and future through computational and analog mediums, including coding and machine learning, data weaving, microorganisms, and live performance. Listed in the top 100 Black women to watch in Canada, her award-winning work on empowered futures for marginalized groups has exhibited in both Canada and the US, notably featured on the White House website during the Obama presidency. Ashley's practice is tied to science and actively incorporates living organisms like slime mold and food cultures, kombucha and sourdough starters to explore ways of decentralizing humans and imagine collective multi-species survival. Ashley Jane Lewis, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to see everybody in the room. It's always lovely when friends show up and they didn't tell you that they were coming. So thank you so much for being here. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm Ashley Jane Lewis. I'm a speculative designer and an Afrofuturistic artist. I spend all of my creative time thinking about how to design, explore, and imagine worlds together, worlds for the long-term future and worlds for tomorrow, and in my favorite work, worlds that are in rapid response to what's happening all around us. I wanted to talk through a few projects with you. I know we only have like 5 minutes, and I'm trying to be really concise. So the work that I do, as Kelsa mentions, explores this through science, through machine learning, through performance, and through community practice. So I wanted to just show you a couple of projects that articulate that to give you a sense of where my positionality is coming from. The first project is one that I really hold dear called the Slime Tech Lab. It's a project about diasporic futures in collaboration with Io Conciende, who has been a New Inc. mentor in the past. This project explores new futures and new conversations about topical issues like borders, diversity, cultural memory in collaboration with slime mold, which is this organism that you can see animated at the top of the screen. It doesn't grow as fast as this animation, which would be pretty dystopian, but this is a time lapse. Slime mold is a incredible microorganism that is really on the minds of many different kinds of Afrofuturists at the moment. Many people are working in collaboration with it, not only because Octavia Butler, who is like the origin of many Black science fiction writers, desires to participate in that genre. She was a hobby scientist who was also very inspired by slime mold, but also because this organism can have predictive properties that mimic and sometimes exceed the capacity of what we're capable of doing with machine learning and artificial intelligence. It has a decentralized way of feeding itself, where cells that are weakest get to feed fastest, and where there are like 200 plus expressions of gender. And so this organism is really exciting to Io and I as we start to think about like new hierarchical structures and new non-hierarchical structures that could allow for othered individuals to feel empowered, to have agency in their community, and to really redistribute the way that we redistribute nutrients and the way that we organize society for those who are most at risk. This is what it looks like at a bird's eye view if you're working with it in a petri dish. Io and I built a structure called the Slime Tech Lab, photographed here, which is a roving science lab that we haul around New York, largely to Black and Brown communities to talk about science, but also to work with machine learning and computer vision to turn our work with slime mold into a collaboration. We designed a sensor that allowed for us to determine the whereabouts of the slime mold inside of these little modules, which you can see here, that allow for us to haul up to a location in Brooklyn, have conversations about slime mold, talk about what we might glean as inspiration from that microorganism that we can use to reimagine how we develop our societies, think deeper about borders, think deeper about how our society is structured in terms of who has power at which times, and then work with slime mold, the organism, to create nonlinear stories about those future worlds with greater intention. So slime mold gets inoculated into these modules. We map its location, and that slime mold gets to launch these stories based on some code we write together, and online display narratives about these new worlds that we design in community with Black and Brown participants. Some photos. Another project I wanted to talk to you about is Opening the Portal, which is a machine learning based project I'm working on as a series of workshops and performances. This is based on some recent master's thesis that I completed at ITP, exploring how more than 70% of our science fiction, more than 70% of our technology that we use every day, the credit card, the cell phone, laptops, was inspired directly by science fiction. Furthermore, 75% of science fiction in its canon is written by white men. So the question I'm exploring in this project is, who writes the future? If that conversation is so cyclical, how can we break that pattern to ensure that fictitious depictions of the future are written by Black and Brown people in order to allow for that to translate into technology that then impacts our society? So this project takes that canon of science fiction, feeds it into a machine learning model, and creates predictions of the future that are then projected through these performances. Every couple of weeks, these performances are also peppered with workshops where I invite Black and Brown individuals to come and write science fiction stories about the future, which we then feed into the machine learning model in hopes that over time we'll get predictions of the future that are more written by us and for us than without us. And the last project I want to talk about, which is probably the one I'm most proud of in the recent history, is a project called Investing in Futures Beyond Policing. This was a project that we launched last summer in rapid response to the murder of George Floyd. And overnight, a series of individuals made it clear that we had the potential to ride off some of this energy around defunding the police and really ask the question of like what we want in replacement of police, knowing that police's history is a recycled depiction of different kinds of ways of oppressing Black people. I think it's really imperative for us as speculative designers to create tangible opportunities for Black and Brown people to articulate what they want in their future, especially as it pertains to community and safety and security. So a group of creatives, this incredible group, assembled truly overnight to launch a call for participation to the general public to have an opportunity to use a gamified framework to imagine a new world in collaboration with abolitionist artists who could bring with us tangible issues that were happening in relationship to policing and Black people. We crossed our fingers and hoped that overnight we would get maybe 20 participants, and we had 300 participants apply from all over the planet, which was really exciting. And this like one-off workshop turned into a whole framework that we ran all summer long. Along with us, these incredible artists decided to jump on board and share their pedagogy as well. Many of these are New Ink people, to share their pedagogy of working through the practice of art to depict different futures that then translate into tangible action inside of communities. So in this series of workshops that ran all summer long and continued into the fall and are scoped to continue again later this spring, we've designed over 100 worlds, and these worlds have already gone on to influence policy changes. So these are all worlds that are depicting both fantastical and practical ways that society could operate without police. And so we've had feedback from mayors, from like high school principals, from community garden leads who have used these worlds to restructure how they operate their communities, which is really a spectacular circle for us. I wanted to share, I love to share this quote because in anticipation of these workshops, we always ask our participants, what a world beyond policing looks like. And one of our participants, who's an actress living in Ghana, Kristen Adele Calhoun, has this quote that we always reference. She calls a world beyond policing a place where the soil is flipped upside down and all the dandelions are free, which I feel like we always return to when we're in need of a little bit of fortification in this space. To give you a glimpse of what happened inside of these workshops that we ran for more than 300 people over the course of the last 6 months, or 10 months, I guess now, time is such a blur. This is an example of one of the participants. This is a participant holding up a music chart. She studies and has studied the work of Duke Ellington, and she's talking about in this moment how we could imagine our structure for society set up a little bit like Duke Ellington scores, where certain musical notes that have to hit surprise and risk in terms of pitch are supported by other notes so that they can have those risks and still feel like settled within the music score, so that the listener can anticipate them, be surprised by them, but then return back to the score. So she's talking about how exciting it would be to think about these notes that have to take greater risks that are supported by other notes as a model for how we might think about how communities might build structures of support, anticipate risk, and then cradle that at-risk individual when they're in their most difficult position. And I think things like this, are peppered throughout the workshops that we ran, which was really beautiful to see how people were taking references from music, from dance, from critical theory, and merging them into new speculations for how we might operate as a community. All of the worlds were given to artists to create depictions with after. We're in the process of, we got a little bit of funding, thankfully, to be able to put this enormous project into an archive, which is wonderful because each one of our worlds was also gifted to an artist to be able to depict in visuals as well. So this is a project, this is an image that was created by Megan Aguirre, and this beautiful image was created by another new inker, Intelligent Mischief, both to depict what worlds might look like under the new frameworks that we had imagined together. And I think I might end it there, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more about how science fiction and speculation get embedded into policy and practice together.
Thank you, Ashley. Yes, love that. I love that as a jumping off point. And thirdly, really excited to introduce fellow New Inc member Eric Moed, who works at the intersection of art, design, and architecture, examining the relationship between history, memory, and society. Eric is an exhibited designer, artist, and architect, and he's completed large-scale public installations in the US and Europe. Moed's projects have been featured very widely in the press. He holds a master's in design studies from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, where he met and collaborated with Penelope Phylactopoulos, who is with us and co-founder of oopsa, Office of Open Practice, a current incubation project at New Inc. Eric, please take it away.
Thanks, Kelsa. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm super excited to be here and so inspired by your work, Ashley and Ariana. And I have to ask, can everyone see my screen where it says future memory?
Yes.
Great, thumbs up. So I'm Eric Moed. I'm a public artist, architect, and designer, as Kelsa just mentioned. I'm gonna very briefly show you a few projects that speak to my process of creating new monuments and memorials and critically analyzing existing ones. So as I run through the first two projects, I would like you to think of them less as sculptural or artistic forms and more as containers for narratives, sites for public expression of past, present, and future memories. So much like Ariana, my work is rooted in a deeply personal foundation. My first public art piece was a temporary monument and pop-up museum in central Portugal. It was in honor of the diplomat that saved my family from the Holocaust, the reason I'm sitting here today. And after decades of his story being suppressed by the fascist Portuguese government, I made this project with the goal of restoring his ancestral home after it was taken away and fell into disrepair. So after months of corresponding with his descendants, grandchildren of Aristides de Sousa Mendez, the diplomat who saved my family. As a grandchild of someone who was saved in the Holocaust, it was really meaningful to work with them. Fortunately, we don't really have much time for the narrative here of this entire story, so I'm going to skip to the end and basically say, through doing something temporary and perhaps mixing and matching a couple of typologies, museum, pop-up, monument, memorial, we achieved the goal of actually restoring the home and getting the EU and the whole crazy bureaucratic mechanization there to release the funds to actually restore the home and turn it into a museum to honor Sousa Mendez. I'm gonna skip to maybe something a little bit more permanent and recent. The former project was from 2013. This is Changing Perspective. It began as a 2017 commission by the city of Jacksonville, Florida for public art, specifically for sculptural bike racks, whatever that means. So my partner on the project and I, architect Samuel Maddox, were specifically intrigued by the fact that the commission included a mandatory public town hall meeting with local Jacksonville residents to hear their thoughts. We figured this is great. We're doing something in public space. We want to hear what the public wants. The town hall took place in July of 2018, and two major themes emerged from it, which are probably not surprising to people. Some citizens of Jacksonville felt that the city had no clear identity, like some cities that are known for a specific building or food, take Superior Pizza or Bagels, for example. And those vocal citizens felt that Jacksonville didn't have any defining factor like that. Another contingent, specifically a number of African Americans in the audience, felt that actually Jacksonville has all the ingredients to have a robust civic identity. Specifically, it has an incredible wealth of Black history and culture. It's simply not represented anywhere in public space. Of course, the Southern moderator tried to immediately change the subject, but we took this call to action very seriously and leaned into the discussion at the town hall, and afterwards spoke to and partnered with a number of cultural and historical institutions run by local Black communities. We made it very clear that we are not here to tell anyone's history or story for them, but rather that we could perhaps provide a canvas to express those histories. So together, we chose 11 sites of Black history and culture to feature in the project, which you'll see on the bottom of your screen. So as you can see on the top right-hand corner of your screen, this here monument functions as a sculptural bike rack on the top, and or rather on the bottom, and on the top, it is a signpost, a memorial marker pointing to local sites of Black history and culture. There is an arrow cutout on each bike rack, which is accompanied by the distance that the bike rack is from the site. So this is a bike rack that not only tells you where to park your bike, but also where you can go. You notice the word Duval, which is the name of the county that Jacksonville is in. Now the county and the city of Jacksonville, Florida are actually the same size. Jacksonville is the largest city by landmass in the US because of redlining and gerrymandering. So people namely know this word in the city as a chant echoed at NFL games, at Jaguars games. But of course, the history of Duval as a chant is very different and not known or discussed in the city. It actually started as a call and response within the hip hop scene in the Black community in the 90s. And many people we spoke to were very gracious about the whole city saying Duval, but they wished that the history and origin of the term was known and recognized. So that's why we chose the word Duval to unite all these sites and bike racks. And the word, of course, emerges as you bike, drive, or walk up the street that this is situated on. So just as your perspective is changed as the word emerges, hopefully people's historical perspectives, especially in regard to who is included and who is not included in finally, I'm going to end on this, a brief overview of Memory Monument, a project which began as my thesis in art, design, and public domain program at Harvard GSD, which has become a catalyst in the design research we're doing at New Ink through my studio, Oopsa, which, of course, my co-founder, Penelope, fellow New Inker, is here. Shout out, Penelope. Memory Monument was conceived of in the shadow of the US's reckoning with its monument and memorial landscape. It puts monuments and memorials in conversation with each other and gets you talking about them too. It connects monuments and memorials through their features. It gives people the language to analyze their forms and the intentions behind them. It's also a lexicon that starts to give language to the typology, themes, and temporality of monuments and memorials. It allows you to understand and be critical of the processes by which monuments and memorials are conceived and implemented. Finally, it gives you the opportunity to make decisions about the monuments and memorials on the cards and imagine new possibilities for future memory. It begins with a tableau. A grid of 100 plus cards is laid out, and each card has a full bleed photo of a monument on the front and characteristics such as typology and temporality on the back. These characteristics can be matched with one another, aiding the participant in learning about, comparing, contrasting, and ultimately reimagining monuments and memorials. Again, if we want the public to be involved in this conversation, we need to develop a shared language to discuss it. This project or provocation is a direct response to the question of what to do with existent problematic monuments and memorials and problematically absent monuments and memorials. For example, in the US, there's no monument or memorial to the Native American genocide in Washington, DC, nor is there a monument or memorial to victims of slavery, two very, very big parts of our history, which are clearly unrecognized in the public domain in Washington, DC as monuments or memorials. What does that mean? And why is that the case? We all know why it's the case, but what are we going to do about it? And what do we do with controversial monuments and memorials like Civil War monuments and memorials once they're removed from public space? Do we immediately throw them in a garbage dump? Do we put them in museums? Do we put them in graveyards? Do we remix and redeploy them? Another good series of questions to discuss. How can we collectively rethink the process of creating, dismantling, and reckoning with our shared memories in service of critical reconciliation and reparations? And finally, I'll end on this. How can we create a new universe of monuments to discourse, monuments to playfulness, monuments to the devalorization of war, and monuments to coexistence? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you all three so much for grounding us in your work and your research and your thinking. I'm so excited to put us into conversation and of course want to jump right to the super bright and uplifting and warming parts. But first, I think you've all kind of spoken about this in one way or another. If you could all kind of specifically talk about the pieces of history that have most galvanized your practice, or what in kind of historical precedents you sort of found that said like, okay, it is time for me to come in and to shift paradigms with the work that I'm doing. Ariana, do you want to start?
I can start off. Yeah, I mean, I think as someone who thinks a lot about how tech and technology has changed cities, I think a lot of the historical precedent that we have thought through in a lot of our work with the mapping project has been around how tools like data and mapping and statistical modeling have been used to enact violence on BIPOC communities, and also reinforced kind of like racial logics about who is or isn't deserving of housing. And so a lot of our work is thinking about ways to reclaim those tools, that might seem like new technologies, right? But in fact are have been ever present, in a long history of racist real estate practices that have led to the exclusion and dispossession of poor and BIPOC communities. And so a lot of our work has been thinking about how to use those platforms to kind of address and redress some of the information asymmetry that I think we often have to navigate in housing justice spaces, and think about issues of kind of data transparency and data disclosure, which is a huge terrain of struggle in housing justice spaces that I think is often kind of overlooked. And thinking about how we can use data as a way to unveil the ways that systems are being abused, and also use them as mechanisms of accountability, given that there's kind of a lack of publicly available information about evictions, or often it's available in a way that isn't legible to the public. And so our work is kind of taking on a lot of that collective labor of trying to make it useful to folks who are trying to like address some of those systemic legacies that I named earlier.
I think for me, I started my career out as almost accidentally as a technology educator for young people, for kids, and really quickly saw how little opportunities there were for Black and Brown kids and youth to be able to learn these technologies. Like, I was working for many different companies and running my own workshops and just seeing the fraction of diversity that would be encouraged and empowered to go to these spaces, and decided to run my own programming that was specifically for Black and Brown youth. And in doing that, you talk about references, right? As you would any kind of workshop for kids. And in talking about references, you realize how imperative it is for young people to see depictions of themselves, to recognize that this is a space that they too could build a career in the future, or even be encouraged or interested in. And then in tandem, I saw how many young people were creating games with code or robotics with code that were about themselves, because they were filling that gap, and recognizing how much of an importance imagination is in trying to like depict how your ecosystem could be. And I think that was like a beginning turning point for me to think through how art could be a visualizer for young folks to see themselves, if not depicted through mainstream media, through storytelling, through performance, and through art, that Black worlds of coders existed, that like Black environments and brown environments of technologically savvy human beings existed. And now, like however many, like a decade and a bit later, you can see how impactful, like it's a cliche, but you can see how impactful like Black Panther is on all of these young people who are trying to like see themselves as coders. Like mainstream culture and visualization really matters. So in recognizing that through the youth work that I was doing, it really changed my approach to my artistic practice to really start to depict a lot of these worlds. And I think a part of that always has maintained its fantasy to allow for like an entry point for kids, but also have grown to see how important that is for adults too, to collectively design and imagine their futures together.
That's beautiful. And I mean, for me, I started out as an architect, and very quickly had a big issue with how much I felt architecture was in service of capital and not people. And I wanted to do something in service of people. And my identity on a personal level was very rooted in narrative and knowing my history, and as an American Jew, and with a lot of intergenerational trauma, and seeing how my community had to fight so hard to have that represented in public, and process it. And that really got me thinking about public space and the paradoxes that exist in public space. And that could mean the commons on the internet, or it could mean public space in another physical reality. We don't need to get into that conversation about virtual versus physical. It's all the same now anyway. But with that being said, the paradox being that people occupy these public spaces, but yet they're policed and perhaps even created by a very select few. And that select few doesn't usually represent the people who actually occupy it. And in fact, polices and also sets up the guardrails for that public to exist within that space. That's a very big problem. So how do we tackle that? And that is what I've been devoting, my work to in this space, and thinking about all these examples, which for now are in this kind of physical deck of memory monument cards, but which we're working on digitizing. A lot of them have backgrounds and origin stories that start with a single individual lobbying a community and a government eventually to actually make things happen. So in order to democratize that language, and we have to kind of find ways to work together to represent these histories, and also provide pathways for the imaginaries that parallel them, to enable people to really use their voices and represent who they are in public space.
I think that's actually maybe like a really good segue into something that we were thinking about when we were organizing this And each of you do this really super well, I think, and are really thoughtful in your approach to building these solutions to some of these problems. Ashley touched on this specifically in her presentation on how she uses machine learning to generate speculative futures using the texts of Black and Brown people as the corpus for this prediction. Eric, similarly in this memory monument project, thinking about the democratization of language and shared language. But I wanted to go a little deeper into how important it is that we build with the voices of those that we are trying to uplift as a primary material. And I'm thinking specifically about this phrase, nothing for us without us. So I was wondering if maybe each of you could kind of speak to that a little.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Oh, sorry, Ariana. I'm happy to start if, sure. I think that, my collaborators and I ask this question a lot, like we get asked this question a lot, whether like what is the importance of building with community versus like imagining worlds on our own. And I think a lot of damage has been done in the past by majority holding identity folks who have imagined worlds in like small clusters individually, have imagined policies for just people who look like them and act as they do. And I think that we all have the capacity to cause harm. And to me, if I want to make impact-driven work and I want to make work that influences how we operate as a society, I run the risk of causing harm if I'm only imagining it from my perspective or from the perspective of a small cluster as well, right? Because we do live in like an oppressive world, and those are kind of ingrained mentalities inside of each of us, and we are each affected by them in different ways because of our proximity to privilege and power. But it's really important to me to work with the communities who are affected by the things we're discussing to envision collectively together what other alternative ways of living could look like. I think as a part of that, there's also a small objective in my work to try and also dismantle the like monolith that is often categorized as like the Black experience, to be able to like infuse all of this work with as many multitudes of definitions of Black and Brown life as possible. It will never be perfect, but in community, it will be better than me speculating individually and creating works and experiences individually from my own perspective or from the perspective of the people I spend most of my time with. So it's a thought process that I think directs a lot of the work that I'm doing.
Yeah, I think this question is something that like we similarly grapple with a lot in the mapping project and also in my personal practice as well. And I think a lot of our work really draws a lot of inspiration from like participatory action research as like an orientation. And like for folks not familiar, it's like a resource orientation that assumes those who have most been like impacted or affected by injustice like hold specific revealing wisdom about that issue, and kind of shifts power about who has monopoly like over knowledge production and tries to shift power there. And so I think a lot of my work and the work of the mapping project, I think, is informed by a similar ethos of like thinking about the tools that have been like most generative for us are ones that have been really anchored, right, in that like idea of like who are the holders of knowledge and like who gets to be the expert, and thinking about storytelling tools like oral history and community mapping, and also memory as like valuable and valid forms of knowledge production that might otherwise be overlooked or dismissed. And even like within using tools of like data visualization and mapping, like I think we also have to like grapple with like the limitations of justice that they suggest that they advance, right? Like seeing doesn't always equal knowing, and visibility doesn't always equal liberation. And so like also tending to those issues of like, even if folks are able to like champion their own representation, that doesn't necessarily like inherently advance justice, and like what are strategies that can lead to community power and transformation as well. So thinking about tools that can complement some of the like issues that we're trying to make visible as well through our work.
I just want to echo that, and I could never do that because that was so well put. But I want to maybe echo the idea of revealing wisdom that's rooted in traumas, and the idea that white supremacy effectively seeks to pit those memories and traumas against one another, and it unfortunately thrives when those memories and traumas are pitted against one another. So instead of comparing traumas, we can learn from those wisdoms, right? And kind of collage them together in new ways, organize those ideas in new ways. Again, giving the pen to the person who should be authoring, the community who should be authoring that wisdom. And thinking about the idea, let's say in the American context, that Black history is American history, right? Jewish history is American history. Asian history is American history, right? These shouldn't always exist as these separate things, hegemonic American history versus the histories of these individualized ethnicities or races or religions, right? It's very important, I think, that we work together to continue to redefine what justice means. And like in my practice, I don't use the term social justice, I just use the term justice because that's what we're seeking. And it's not a given, and it has to continually be redefined. Like Ariana was just saying, I mean, we really need to kind of not take these terms for granted. Like Tommy was saying earlier, the terminology is really important, and giving the space to unpack that terminology and giving people just little kinds of, again, pieces of wisdom to collage together so that they can take them and run with them, I think is really the key for I think all of our practices, frankly.
Really beautiful. I think it's great to hear all of you share in such different practices that you have and the different roles that you play in collectivizing upon some of that wisdom. Very, very much. And I think a lot of what I'm hearing, and I think Ariana put a really fine point on it, is around, that the idea that representation is not the equivalent of liberation, that a lot of work, and I think art can often fall into these trappings because art has the power to be provocative and, to kind of like land really hard with a thud. But what does it mean to go a step beyond provocation and to kind of actually cultivate and build a social practice? And I think, particularly in the context of the folks who are here with us today, who perhaps might not have the immediate community or knowledge or tools to do that, I think I want to get into the science fiction piece, Ashley, and I want to get into this kind of like concept of collective imaginaries. And I also would sort of maybe throw to you all as something to take or leave. Where's the gate? How do we enter into these kind of zones of experience where we're able to collectively build without the fear that our narrative is, a sub-narrative to Eric's point, or that one's community is somehow other, right? So like, what are both the ways that you are imagining and the kind of threads of imagination that you're excited about, and also what advice do you have to people who want to be breaking into this work and to be kind of finding their own collective?
I think that there's lots of different approaches. One approach that is not my own, but I admire greatly, is the work of Simone Leys. She has this incredible article where she articulates the importance of going underground, meaning that the work that has the most impact for the most people has for the Black community, is, as she's articulating this, cannot be done in the mainstream view. It can't be done under the surveillance of all of the individuals who have like worked in oppression of that community. And so she spends a lot of time Yeah, this is it. Great, thank you. That was very quick. That was not scripted. She talks about the importance of taking your work out of the public eye and embedding it in community and spending extensive amounts of time with that community developing that work in order to then, when it's strong and solid, release it into the public. And I guess when I'm saying work, I don't necessarily mean like an artwork or an installation, but like a policy or a community practice or a mutual aid. Taking this underground, working on it with your community, strengthening it, understanding where the like weak spots are, and embedding more resources into those spots in order to then practice it in public, to be able to say, this is what we're doing. This is what means the most to our community. And we're not necessarily taking feedback, you know? And I think that there's something really interesting about that as a practice. It's challenging to do when you need things like funding and other elements. And of course, Simone Lay uses her incredible platform to make some of these things possible. And I'm sure there are lots of other nuances that go into the practice of it all. But I do think the active decision to take work underground and then re-release it is really fascinating and really compelling, and is the true tale of many of the ways in which activism has taken place in the Black history and in the women's rights history, right? Women used to meet over like recipe swaps to plan different kinds of revolutions, right? There was all kinds of obfuscation that took place in trying to ensure safety for Black people as they traveled. So it's not an unpracticed thing, but it is really interesting to see her articulate it today as a methodology of hers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the, like, to get like kind of like practical too with this question, like one of the things that I think comes up a lot with the mapping projects work is like I get a lot of opportunities to like talk about the work that we do, and often like get questions around like, oh, what are like some of the policy aims of like your work, and yeah, how is your work kind of advancing kind of like housing reform at a policy level? And I think like over time, I think we've gotten like a lot clearer, like in our view and perspective, that like the work that we're producing, that like we're interested in answering to like organizers and to like movement spaces, as opposed to like answering to kind of like the policy or nonprofit industrial complex frame. And I think like a lot of the answer to that question connects to this idea of imagination, that I think it is in like movement and organizing spaces, that there like is more room to like dream and imagine possibilities and demands that like exist outside of those like more narrow or limiting paradigms. You know, because often when something gets to like the policy level, it's often like a watered down version of something that existed in more of like a radical and imaginative space before. And so I think that like has been kind of like a compass and a guide for like the work that we produce, is like really understanding that like every map that we make is really in service of and with the goal of like advancing demands that are being made in housing justice spaces, and like really taking cues from that space and producing work that's like in service of and meeting the needs of those folks, rather than just like producing maps for map's sake that just can like live and float on the internet like as a representational tool. Like they're most effective like when they're made in tandem with movement demands and organizers and like the power that lives in those spaces.
Yeah, this reminds me of Gil Scott-Heron's "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," which I think people overlook the last line of that song/poem, which is "The revolution will be live." And it has to always be live, right? It has to be a living thing. And sometimes it's behind the scenes, and sometimes it's in the streets, and sometimes it's both. But I think these zones of experience that Kelsa is referring to are so multiplicitous. Like they speak to absences that have existed in public for years and years in the, I guess, the hegemonic eye, right? But not in the communities that of course have been experiencing them. And I think the key takeaway for approaching this work, I guess from my end, is you got to put in the time to do the crime. It's slow and low work, right? Like you got to understand and respect the context. This isn't like doing a project where just like there's a site and that's the context. The site is the people that you're working with. And these are real people. These are people who have finite resources, finite time, finite interest, frankly, right? And you have to respect all those things, and the work's going to take a long time. And you just have to go in knowing that and recognizing that. And ultimately, the key to a project like that is that, and the ultimate, I guess, mic drop is that you can just walk away and have nothing to do with it, and it's thriving on its own, and your name doesn't need to be all over it, and your fingerprints don't need to be all over it, right? At the end of the day, it's just functioning, and it's there for people in public. End of story.
I really love that. It makes me think of the slime mold again, right? Where all of you in your various ways are talking about like plurality and you know the incredible health and resilience of working in groups. And I think, Eric, you keep coming back to this idea of hegemonic history, hegemonic culture, and I think that we've been taught to fear the messiness of plurality, and you know, and yeah, like big, fast-moving slime mold. There's like something unsettling about that. There's also something really, really powerful and radical and thoroughgoing and, you know, unflinching about that. So thank you all for those both radical and also very practical ways in to think about this work. I want to invite, if anyone in the audience, I've seen some thoughts trickling in. If anyone has questions, would like to unmute, would like to pop things in the chat. If you don't want to unmute, we're here for it. We're together for another few minutes.
Maybe while we're waiting for a question to come in or someone to pop in, I think along the same, you know, topic that we were discussing before, Amelie had some great thoughts in the chat, just kind of like the difference between a grand gesture and maybe like what I will coin as a micro gesture, or like the power of sustained gestures, small sustained gestures, and how both of those can be just as powerful.
And in being micro, you can also be sustained. Yeah, whereas being grand makes it much harder. Galen has a question here about how do you assess how much you're putting your own perspectives into collective-based work? Great question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I guess, you know, it's a tough one to answer. And I think that the reason why it's tough is because it's, to me, it's like a gut instinct thing to see, I think maybe because I've spent a lot of time teaching, I think a lot of people who are in that space have a sensibility of when your class, for instance, is losing the plot line of the math equation you're trying to describe, right? And I think that there's a similar kind of skill set that you could peel off of that and put into community-based work where you're noticing moments where perhaps your philosophies are being repeated to you in a way that's like perhaps too circular or too self-gratifying, and we're not creating space that's like welcoming enough for individuals to bring their personal perspectives. So oftentimes for me, it's like an internal metric. I don't know that I've found like an actual like set of identifiers to show that like, oh, we've reached too much personal in perspective in this project. But I do think that, you know, for myself, I really like to think about these projects as like developing like a framework. So not really to even like present it as something that is like an idea of yours for them to implement, but rather like, here are a series of steps that we can go through to think about something together. And so designing that framework rather than like discussing your work at the foreground, I think allows for people to really put themselves into the projects in a way that's like safe and supported. So maybe it's on top of being a sensibility in your gut, it might also be the way that like a project is presented that allows for more of other people and less of you.
Great.
Yeah, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
I think I was just going to echo that. Like, I think my mind was going to a similar place of like, around like frameworks and creating like a container for like decisions and processes to happen that are like rooted in shared values and a shared vision. Because I think that that can always be something to like come back to and ground in, because like the personal biases are like always already there. And so just like having something to ground in during those like possible divergent moments that everybody can come back to and anchor in, and like having, if it is collective work, like having a set of practices that you all agree to and commit to support that.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think identity is really complex and multiplicitous, as we mentioned, but and real, and informs the work. But having a framework that's versatile and adaptable, and I'll add one that hopefully just disappears as time goes on, right? Like if it's meant to educate, and then again have the ideal audience, or the audience that you're working with, or the community that you're working with, take it and run with it. I think the key is not to be too sentimental about that framework, right? Once it gets to a certain point, it's actually meant to be messed with. It's actually meant to be challenged. It's actually meant to be owned by whomever you're working with ultimately.
I'm curious about this question that Ruby put into the chat, the small sustained gestures. I think there are a couple ways to read this question. I think that one way that I'm reading it is maybe outside of the public view, small sustained gestures between myself and artists that I like to share headspace with, collaborators, or even just friends who have a practice outside of art who are dedicated to a similar kind of objective. I think that we do a lot of like reading together, which sounds like maybe boring, but it's actually really lovely. There are friends of mine who set up like little reading sessions where people can just drop in and read aloud from a couple of things that are really compelling for them. There's a lot of individuals who have created collectives, kind of informal collectives. There's one called AI Assembly for Black folks who are working inside of the technology sphere. Stephanie Jenkins heads up those. And those are just email threads that are sharing news, sharing funding opportunities, sharing accolades about each other's work. And I think that especially when we're remote, those kinds of small gestures of community are really important, really fortifying. I don't know about everyone in this chat, but it's really easy to feel drained on these matters on a daily basis, and being able to touch point with community, I think, is really imperative. So that's like one way to read that question. I think there are other ways to read it around like what is sustainable for a community, what are small gestures that are sustainable for a community. And one that's really been inspiring for me in that regard is the Bed-Stuy Strong Mutual Aid group, who are just like really nailing it and have created a wonderful framework for people to have like groceries delivered, to share food and financial resources as well. And when I watch those kinds of things take place, thanks Kelsey, you're so fast. When I watch things like that take place, I don't know, those are really beautiful depictions of how communities just figure it out and like have been figuring it out for centuries, right? And so those kinds of tiny gestures like grocery delivery, where everybody delivers like maybe once a month, but there are hundreds of people delivering. Those are small, sustained gestures that really make a community continue to exist, you know, outside of the support of the governing bodies. So maybe those are not the ways you'd hope we'd read that question, but those are two ways that occurred to me.
Yeah, I feel like my answer was also kind of going to like the relationship-based place, and like finding that like relationships are what I think ground me and keep me accountable to the work that I do. There's this book called Trauma Stewardship that I like revisit often, and it's like kind of about sort of ways to take care of yourself when you like advance work that like holds and processes a lot of trauma. And I think one of the like lessons from that book is like about assembling the support systems around yourself of folks that like not only like share a similar political analysis as you and can like hold you accountable and be a mirror to you and keep you in check if you like fall off course, but also similarly like recognizes that like isolation and alienation is often like an outgrowth of oppression, and like feeling like we have to like process things alone or take care of ourselves as alone, and like that relationship based way of finding grounding and healing, I think can kind of address some of the like alienation and isolation that I think sometimes we're like conditioned to think we have to like take care of ourselves in isolation, and that's not the case.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would also add practicing joy. This is gonna, people, when they hear this, like you'll either resonate with this or you'll find this like maybe just like a little bit too lofty. But to me, joy is a really important act of resistance for Black and Brown communities. The entire history of oppression that exists in the attempt to perhaps exterminate these communities has always been around, first and foremost, removing opportunities for joy, removing opportunities for gathering, for celebration, for song, for music, for dance. Like, you know, every piece of history of Indigenous culture in Canada, like that was the first thing that was tackled, was trying to remove opportunities for people of marginalized communities to experience joy. And so I think that one sustainable gesture is finding ways for you to experience joy. That's an incredible act of resistance and a real way to reclaim a lot of the lost history of your own lineage, right? To be able to like show incredible tribute to the kinds of suffering that people have gone through in the past. So that is also, I think, something that's worth sustaining and worth creating small gestures around as well.
And eating food, don't forget to eat. It's a very important thing. I know I'm the Jewish mother here, but I'm just saying food and joy, very connected. And humor. I mean, humor is the ultimate tool, I think, to conquer oppression, frankly. It's very hard to combat. And there is a crisis of loneliness going on all across the world, and especially I think in the States. I mean, I think things like the opioid epidemic really speak to that, and how our communities have kind of just dissolved. And I think instead of letting conservatives kind of use that as their platform, right, the disillusion of community and all that BS, it's really important that we find ways, especially those of us who are interested in working in public, to get to know our immediate publics. I mean, there's all this crazy, you know, white savior BS where people are like going to different continents to do work. It's like, do you know your neighbors? Do you know where the local old age home is? Do you know the kids on your block that might need tutoring? Right? Like, start local. There's plenty of people, especially if you're here in New York, that you could certainly bond with and have a small gesture like a phone call a week with for an hour, right? And that can make all the difference in their lives. And if you're not plugged in to that frequency, then I would argue that you'd have a very hard time actually doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps to close us out, if you could all briefly say in response to Charles' great question about working with youth. Eric, you touched on it just now in your example, but ideas for working with youth, ways you love working with youth. Ashley, you spoke about this a lot in your intro.
I know, I just feel like I've gone first every time. So I was like, I'm not going to go first this time. But yeah, I think that it's really central to a lot of the work that I'm doing. So I'm trying to unpack like ways of working with youth. I guess, you know, trying to find opportunities for them to hold like authority and responsibility inside of these conversations is really wonderful. Like a lot of the work that we do with youth and with the general public and like mixed audiences, we tend to meet with youth first to give them a sneak peek of what's going on, to allow for them even to understand some of the computational work that's happening behind the scenes, so that when we meet in the larger group, there's less of an opportunity for youth to feel intimidated. They have like a sense of authority coming into those workshops and those experiences. So that's something that's worked really well for us. Working with youth is really challenging because they are so right. And they really point out when your thought processes are probably not aligned with what they believe to be true and what is true and what is obviously always so much more progressive. So you have to get comfortable with having your opinion challenged, which I think is really important. And I think something that doesn't really get acknowledged all the time. Like, it's challenging to be like, you're right. Wow, I have to rethink that. So just a couple of food for thought, I guess.
Yeah, my career foundations are very much in like youth work and social work, and so like that continues to like guide me, even though I no longer kind of like do work in kind of a youth development context. I think some of the ways it's shown up in the Staying Power project that I shared earlier is like trying to we use like a tool called Photo Voice, which is kind of like an outgrowth of the participatory action research methodology that kind of gives cameras to young folks as tools for research and storytelling about place. And I think even though I'm like no longer working in like a traditional youth development context, I think I'm always trying to find ways to like incorporate young people into my projects, because I think they like continue to like keep me accountable, and also like continue to be like coming back to imagination. I think like they've often like pushed the boundaries of my work and my thinking in ways that I always continue to be inspired by and grounded in.
Yeah, I mean, working with kids, I mean, at the risk of getting in trouble, it's like the opposite of working with British people. They really force you, they confront you, and they force you to think different ways. And in our work, I think basically there's the kid test and the grandma test, right? If you can pass both of those tests, you're in very good shape, because those are your biggest critics. And I can say Penelope and I luckily have very good relationships with our grandmas, and do seriously put our work in front of them. And we're also trying to incorporate work with kids as well. I mean, recently we did a project called La Basura de Todos, which it translates to everybody's trash. And we were commissioned to work with communities in Mexico to teach kids about the environmental impact of their trash, and also the impact of labor on trash collectors, because of course they don't have like garbage trucks and all the infrastructure that we have here. So how do you take such a complex concept and translate it for children? And the last thing you want to do is hit them over the head with it, right? So I mean, you don't want to do anything with hitting, obviously, when it comes to children. I just had one, I can confirm that. But in all seriousness, we basically, with that project, were able to take these very lofty, intense concepts of ecological damage and labor and damage through labor, and basically say, well, what kind of trash do you have at home? What are you going to keep for yourself? What are you going to give to the trash collector? Can you make something with your recycling, maybe to thank your trash collector for all the hard work he or she is doing? And what happens to your trash after it leaves your home, right? And again, this kind of open-endedness is really something that I think working with youth forces you to do. And I wish that more people would put more time into doing that.
Thank you. And thank you, Charles, for the question. So that's it for our time together today, folks. Thank you so much, Ashley, Eric, Ariana, for your time and your engagement and your thinking with the dirty and messy and thrilling, ecstatic work of collective imagination. So grateful for all of your time. And those of you joining us, again, deep appreciation. If you are interested in more information on New Ink, feel free to follow the links dropped in the chat. And we have a final program of our open call period coming up Friday. It's a lunchtime program, 2 p.m. Eastern, all about how we might think about forgiving and caring for people who might otherwise be canceled in the public sphere. A couple of really, really brilliant minds talking about that on Friday. So thank you all again so much for your time. Have a wonderful evening, rest of your day.
Thank you, Kelsa. Thank you, New Ink,
Tommy, Pioneer
for
Work.
inviting us. Come visit us. We're here as well in Red Hook. And make one compassionate micro gesture a day.
Beautiful. Peace,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone. The apply page is also linked in the chat. Applications are due on April 20th next week. Bye, everyone.